Welcome. Thank you very much for joining me today. My name is Olivia Ladie. I'm with the Climate Adaptation Science Centers with U.S. Geological Survey, and I'm going to talk to you about work in partnership with Rick Palmer, who's at University of Massachusetts Amherst, and our work on extreme rainfall in the Northeast and Midwest portions of the country. So a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. I'll talk to you about the U.S. Geological Survey, Climate Adaptation Science Center, sort of who we are, what we do. And then we'll talk about the management challenge for natural resource managers in the region of heavy rainfall and how we're working to inform risk assessments in floodplain management. And then just talk generally about the challenges of working directly with resource managers on climate change and sort of how we approach some of those challenges. So about the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, many of you may be familiar with this, but our mission and goals, we are really about delivering the best available science to fish and wildlife managers, folks working on ecosystem management across the country, responding to high priority management challenges, fostering really good, sustained, substantive, meaningful engagement with resource managers and scientists, and really providing science to support sound conservation and natural resource management. Our structure, so we are a federal university partnership across the country, built of lead universities and their partners in the region. We have principal investigators across the country, and on the university side, we also have program managers and communication staff. On the federal side, we have administration support as well as research staff at some of our centers. We have a university 5-year cooperative agreement that funds the work of research fellows, graduate students, postdocs, to address the pressing issues of resource managers in the region through new graduate degrees. And then we also do calls for proposals for work done by USGS partners, as well as university partners in the region, funding about 4 to 5 new projects each year. So the work I'll be talking about today is from our Northeast partnership with the University of Massachusetts, Amherst as lead organization, and their partners in the region. One other thing that's common across all of our centers that I think is important for doing climate service work, climate partnership work in the region, we have an advisory committee comprised of resource managers from federal, state, tribal agencies in the region who help develop a strategic science plan, a 5-year science plan that identifies the priorities and informs our calls for proposals. We engage really heavily in partner coordination in the region with other federal, primarily federal climate partners in the region, but also state, local, and NGO partners. We all have tribal resilience liaisons who act as liaisons, working with tribal communities in the regions, those natural resource departments in tribes, and bridging with university partners and other climate scientists. We engage really heavily in fellows training, supporting the next generation of scientists, and then offer technical assistance. So where folks are engaged in large-scale management planning and want to integrate climate change, we'll provide support. So stepping deeper into the issue of extreme precipitation in the region. So many of you know that the Northeast and Midwest are pretty special in experiencing increases in extreme rainfall events in the region, where including these mega rainfall events that are happening, for example, in Minnesota, the graph covering 6,000 square miles of rainfall. Major concern, major issue for natural resource managers. So you have the first issue of safety, like you have state parks, national parks where you have people camping not too far from some of these areas, and there have been close calls. Loss of habitat, so these areas are inundated and no longer provide the breeding or non-breeding habitat for wildlife. These lands are supposed to be open for wildlife viewing, hunting, fishing, etc., and they become inaccessible. These floods can cause widespread release of invasive species and undo years of restoration work. They can also lead to local extinctions. So for example, timber rattlesnake. There was a local extinction after a major flood in the southeastern part of Minnesota. But natural resources also have a huge role to play in reducing the effects not only on ecosystems, but also on human systems in floodplain management. So one of our projects led by Rick Palmer and Keith Nislow from U.S. Forest Service, it's about slowing the flow of heavy rainfall events and precipitation for climate resilience. So it became very much in partnership with resource managers in the region. One of the first steps was a workshop and asking through a survey, what are you most concerned about? And primary concern is flooding for resource managers. And Rick, with students, led work to look at 100-year floods and design floods and look at that pattern for Massachusetts and where were areas of highest vulnerability and where you see widespread increases in 100-year floods, particularly in the fall season, largely due to increases in precipitation in those rain and snow events. Also a huge component of engagement, right? So with these workshops, a couple that were held, it's really about building community, making partnerships and relationships between resource managers and folks who might help with expertise to deliver for a particular topic, understanding how to get the most adaptation value from particular management actions, and again, sort of building connections so that you can continue this conversation forward because it won't be resolved in one sitting. And again, so part of that project, so looking at particular management actions, so culvert replacement, wetland conservation, sort of what might demonstrate whether or not we've made progress on this issue, acres protected, stream restoration and sinuosity, et cetera. And then again, identifying those strategies on how we can use natural resources, the natural wetland system, floodplain, to protect organisms, to protect people, protect the environment, and communicating that widely for partnership. Another issue in the Midwest portion of the region is, again, heavy rainfall and flooding, and particularly looking at floodplain forests. And after major flooding events, the widespread tree mortality that has been experienced. And these are really important for neotropical migrants along the Mississippi River corridor. So this is a new project that we're starting up, led by Tony D'Amato from University of Vermont, one of our consortium PIs, and another partner from Forest Service, Brian Palick, to look at which planting approaches are more effective at restoring and maintaining vulnerable forests like these floodplain forests. And they, again, do this in partnership with Wisconsin DNR, Minnesota DNR, and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, really looking to have our research inform and improve conservation outcomes. So what are some of the challenges to this work broadly? Well, one, these are public investments. So a particular national wildlife refuge, it may be designated to maintain a particular type of habitat or support a particular organism on the landscapes. They're not flexible if they continue to be inundated. The divestment process to then reinvest in a new location that might be more suitable is very difficult and very challenging. Two, these systems are experiencing rapid change. So we might have local extinctions after one extreme event. So in the case of the Corner blue butterfly, it was after a drought experience. We also have invest a lot in short-term research, 1-year projects, 2-year projects, sometimes 3-year projects. Seldom do we have sustained long-term efforts beyond individual sites that can help inform how we might proceed going forward. And that's been a shortcoming of generally climate work, at least on climate impacts and adaptation work. I must say, modeling the streams has been a challenge, and communicating what we do know and what we don't necessarily know, and how much confidence we have, especially when we come to regulatory action. That has been a challenge. And then last, the cognitive bias that people have relative to extreme events and sort of how we perceive them to either occur very frequently or not frequently evolve at all, and folks being on sort of a widespread spectrum relating to just how they are not attuned to processing things that don't happen as often. A couple ways of how we sort of address some of these challenges in our project expectations. When we do a call for projects and expect new work, we want folks to really articulate a connection to a resource management concern, a decision, and how this new information will affect the decision process. We also want them to identify how partners are going to be actively engaged in throughout the whole life cycle of the project, and how what the expected products are and how they will be used. And that's all on top of sort of using the best techniques. Also, for fostering success, communication, early, often, sustained. So we have regular communications with project leads. We expect them to also have regular communication with natural resource managers. We also have regular communication with natural resource managers. We foster partnerships when we see gaps in particular projects or gaps in networks or workshops. We sort of build and sort of help foster those connections, identifying people to work with. We really promote information exchange, hosting workshops, webinars, and the exchange needs to be two-way. It's not just about academics giving information to resource managers, but vice versa. And I would argue vice versa needs to be emphasized. And then evaluation, learning from what projects have worked well, why they worked well, and using that to inform project selection and enhancing ongoing and existing projects. In terms of opportunities, if you want to engage with us more, we're going to have a call for proposals winter, spring of 2021. So this spring of 21, winter, so early next year. Connect with us if you want to know connections with other climate researchers. We offer workshops and trainings, technical assistance, and then you can always follow our newsletter, our national newsletter. Thank you for your time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation on climate information and the wildland fire community, a services perspective. So back in the late 90s, I started a program at the Desert Research Institute that we called Climate Ecosystem and Fire Applications. And the mission of the program at the time basically had 6 elements: performing fire climate studies and applied research, developing climate decision support tools for fire applications, serving as a liaison between fire, natural resource, and scientific research communities, providing a number of climate and weather forecasting products, establishing partnerships for the integration of climate information, planning, and policy, and providing climate and weather information directly for fire and ecosystem decision-making and strategic planning. Back in the 90s, climate and fire, I mean, it was recognized there was a relationship, but it was not as popular as a subject as it is today. And over the years, our program has evolved and become embedded in fire agencies in such a way that I can even have a little fun by creating a fake trademark called Making Up Data since 1998, since this has been a big part of what we've done for our climate services in relation and for fire agencies. So when we think about climate services for fire, there's different aspects of fire. And so what is it that we're actually addressing? Of course, wildfire makes it on the news all the time. Here's a picture from the Bastrop, Texas wildfire in 2011. But on the right is prescribed fire. And this is a very active element of what agencies do throughout the year across the country. There's typically four major programs that fire management agencies have: suppression, fuels management, preparedness, and prevention. So the question is, when providing a service, what is it about that service? Which of these is it going into? And having an understanding of what each of these programs are about is very beneficial to provide that context for how the service is going to be used. Now, there's a big difference between climate and weather. And in fire, I think of it this way, that climate enables fire. So the picture on the left shows grassland fuels. On the left side of the fence are fuels that have not been managed in any way. And so fire will carry quite well through those fuels. On the right, the fuels have been cut down. In the right photo, this is a forest area showing drought and beetle kill. Both of those, of course, are climate related. So what climate is doing for fire, it's setting up a background, it's setting up underlying conditions, and that can be pre-fire, but those underlying conditions are also going to be there during fire. Weather, on the other hand, drives fire. Here's a video of the EF3 tornado that went through Redding in 2017, basically turned into a 2-mile long and a half-mile wide tornado track. So weather is very much impacting and driving the current conditions, whereas climate is providing that background. We're seeing a lot of extreme fire now. This has been increasing, especially over the last couple of decades. We're seeing more large fires, and not only just fires, even individual fires being large, but also the number of fires occurring simultaneously. In 2020, quite remarkable year in California for this. Here's a look at those fires on August 24th. 0800, and you can see the fire scattered around the state. And the picture on the right is the Creek Fire blowing up on September 5th of 2020. So these extreme fires are happening in conjunction with more climate extremes, and of course they're related. They're not disconnected. But again, the question is, or the thing to consider is, how are we thinking about climate services when we're seeing extremes in both these places, the fire and the climate? So in terms of implementing climate services for fire, the theme of this session is about before, during, and after extreme events. Thinking about this for before and during on the left side, this is a classic fire behavior triangle showing topography, fuels, climate, and weather. And fire behavior, there's many different aspects of that. It's severity, intensity, the duration, the rate of spread, crown, surface, complexity, size, and season. And so climate and weather, of course, are big factors. And here in the green are those 5 climate elements that are primarily a factor for fire behavior. But of course, they're also related into what those fuels are going to look like, and the ignition. While a large percentage of fire ignition is a human source, lightning, of course, is a natural source that can occur and does occur across much of the U.S. On the right is thinking about after a fire, where climate services might fit in. The big question is plant succession. What is that landscape going to look like once a fire has gone through? Part of that will come naturally. Part of that succession may happen depending on how an agency wants to try and restore a particular landscape. But there on the top, you see that pre and post weather, and we can also say climate, is going to be a very critical factor in that succession. So this is just another example of how we might think about the context of performing or implementing a climate service in fire. So what makes a climate service for fire work? Here's a list of some ideas. This is not necessarily everything, but some of the areas I think worthy of highlighting. These would apply to a lot of areas. I think a number of these are not strictly just about fire, but ones that I find come to mind from my years of experience anyway. And so, that trusted relationship, that certainly has made a big difference. Agency partnerships, I think those are very important. And by that, I'm referring to not just partnerships within the agencies, but the public, government agency partnerships, and even including private sector partnerships. There's certainly a role for that here in a climate service for fire. Rapid response, that is, climate is more slowly evolving, but being able to respond to a climate request need is very helpful. Co-development of climate training, finding those relevant entry points into a decision support system is very helpful. But out of all this list, the last one here is relatable information. And I think this one's might really be at the top of the list. And that is, I use an example here on the right, where we have a project in Victoria, Australia, taking a number of CMEP5 climate models, which of course have temperature and precipitation and other climate elements in them. Now you could just provide a decision maker in fire, a fire manager, with something about temperature, something about precipitation, how that's changing through the decades and over the century. But what's really most beneficial to them is when you can take that and convert those data and put that into their own decision support tools. So for example, this plot shows forest fire danger index, the number of days that exceed a value of 25 in that index for a particular location in Victoria, Wangaratta. So this is will have much more meaning to fire management, because on a day-to-day basis, or when they're thinking about their season planning, that's the sort of thing that they're looking at, is the exceedances of a particular fire danger threshold. Another example is, of course, data itself. And at the Western Regional Climate Center, where I'm at, we're very heavily involved with data. The remote automatic weather station is the key data input and source for fire operations. A number of data aspects that are related to a climate service: the collection, the archiving, the quality control, formatting, and distribution. These are the kind of data that make up the fire danger sign that you see driving along the road sign and entering parks and forests, for example. Another example is the significant wildland fire potential outlook. We were involved in helping co-develop these starting in the early 2000s. These are monthly forecasts or monthly outlooks of significant fire potential. There is an integration of a lot of past, current, predicted climate and fuels information. So in terms of a climate service, it's making all these different products available, and the ability to interpret those, and the ability to relate to fuels, and the ability to convert that into a fire outlook. Another one is evaporative demand drought index. This is a fairly new tool, but there's actually 3 examples here where we can talk about where it's used before a significant fire. They're used in seasonal fire outlook presentations. They've been used to brief, say, CAL FIRE officials in California before, but also during. They've been found to be beneficial in providing severity funding requests, which mitigates losses to improve suppression response capability. And after these, EDI is starting to be incorporated into the fire behavior field reference guide and curriculums taught to long-term analysts and fire behavior analysts. I have an example here from Oklahoma. We could think of connecting all these different pieces of climate information. There's growing season rains that leads to fuel growth. You have a La Nina, persistent dryness. This transitions to drought. You have a period of accelerated drying. This increases, or you have increasing fire trends that go with this, and then your weather systems come in for the daily fire. And this actually occurred in Oklahoma in 2017, where we had the wetting rains, the fuel growth, La Nina, the drought conditions, the increased fire danger, the critical fire conditions, and led to basically the most extreme fire season in Oklahoma fire history. Many areas now are having substantial impacts, residential areas from fire moving in, destroying many homes. We can work backwards on this top chart by thinking about residential fires, but to have that, you need extreme burning conditions, and to have that, you need severe wildfire potential. So we're back to that fire behavior triangle that I introduced early on. And of course, the consequences of this is firefighting resources are overwhelmed, the firefighting effectiveness is reduced, and then you have a wildland urban interface fire disaster. So in terms of climate service, thinking about where the aspects of the climate services fits into a disaster sequence like this. Lastly, fire behavior deals with statistical ensembles. Wildland fire does not merely resemble a climatic or meteorological phenomena, it results from them and is thus another order removed from simple determinism. This is Stephen Pine in 1982, and I can assure you that this has not changed several decades later. So the climate information path to a fire, we can think of it as time and space. And we can start on the left with season to month outlooks, migrate into the daily outlook, short term. This leads into an imminent significant fire threat where red flag warnings are issued. That goes to decision support systems and incident management response. And you can see the different scales here going from national, regional, state, and local. And the very last thing to remind folks is fire is a very complex coupled socio-ecological system. So for effective fire climate services, this should be recognized. So here's my postcard from Reno. Thanks very much for watching.
Hi everyone, my name is Emily Elias. I'm the director of the USDA Southwest Climate Hub. And today I am going to describe the evolution of the Drought Learning Network and tell the story of how exceptional drought in 2018 over the Colorado Plateau spurred this group of people to come together and form the Drought Learning Network. But first I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, Brian Fuchs with the National Drought Mitigation Center, Elizabeth Waite with the National Integrated Drought Information System, and Katie Steele with the USDA Southwest Climate Hub. With 4 deserts and the Colorado Plateau within its boundaries, most of the Southwest Hub mainland region is classified as semi-arid to arid. Of course, the region is no stranger to dryness, but drought is an ever-present threat to water resources, forests, and agriculture, and to the health and economic well-being of rural and urban communities in the region. The 2018 exceptional drought persisted over the Four Corners region, and during that time, water dried up, crops failed, forests burned, rangeland conditions deteriorated, livestock and wild horses died from lack of water. During this time, we witnessed not only the devastating impacts on tribal and other communities, but we also witnessed the extraordinary responses that were possible when people collaborated in finding solutions. This image shows the longer-term impacts of drought on crop loss. We're looking at 1989 to 2018 total indemnity payments by the Risk Management Agency for crop loss due to drought, and those totaled more than $48 billion. Drought is represented here along with other billion-dollar disasters between 1980 and 2020. It's evident that the economic costs of extreme events have increased over time. At the same time, we're in an era of physical non-stationarity, such that the risks we assumed in the past may not hold in the future. This leads to a greater uncertainty and perception of risk. It was the devastating drought of 2018 that inspired the Southwest Climate Hub, National Drought Mitigation Center, and National Integrated Drought Information System to come together with other partners and thought leaders and create the Drought Learning Network. The first goal of the Drought Learning Network is retaining management lessons during and previous droughts, helping managers share their lessons in planning for and responding to and recovering from drought. In January 2020, the founding team surveyed 60 natural resource managers in the Southwest. 95% were interested in information about best practices and lessons learned by other resource managers during drought. The second goal of the Drought Learning Network is fostering knowledge exchange between resource managers and climate service providers. When we know what questions people are trying to answer and what data they need for decision making, when we know how they prefer to access information, then we can better provide what information managers need for anticipating and preparing for drought, for managing through a drought, and for recovering from a drought. On the flip side, we also know that data doesn't always tell the whole story about drought. Information supplied from managers to climate service providers about impacts on the ground is just as important. And a third goal of the Drought Learning Network is responding collectively and rapidly and nimbly during future drought to foster resilience. As we were developing the Drought Learning Network, experts came together and suggested some components of the network that could be helpful. The first is case studies. And these case studies would be written for and/or by managers who recently experienced and responded to drought, documenting what worked well and what might not have worked well. We also discussed a resilience reporter, and this is so that land managers can report their efforts structured around specific information, including the cost, efficacy, and evaluation of responses. The idea of a hive mind listserv was also mentioned, and this is really an ask an expert or ask a resource manager forum that would allow rapid responses from the climate services community or the resource manager community. Another component is, or an idea is really to schedule knowledge exchange around a specific challenge, such as water scarcity or range conditions. Another component is really targeted webinars, workshops, and presentations, and this has been really important, especially the virtual webinars this year, because we launched this effort in January 2020 and then had our in-person meeting in February 2020, and then COVID hit. So we've done everything virtually that I'm reporting on. And then finally, there was an idea of a drought management database. One already exists, and modifying that for the group was suggested as a component to consider. To date, the Drought Learning Network includes 67 climate service providers and resource managers, and members belong to one or more of 6 teams within the network. The case studies team are building a database of case studies and best practices to support peer-to-peer learning. They have 8 case studies underway, and these will be hosted on the Collaborative Conservation and Adaptation Strategy Toolbox website, or CCAST website, that was initially developed by the Desert LCC, or Landscape Conservation Cooperative. So that was underway prior to the formation of the Drought Learning Network, but something network partners chose to use to share information. The Beginning Farmers and Ranchers team elected to partner with existing efforts, and one of those was with the Quivira Coalition to present drought tools to the new agrarian program participants. They didn't have any drought information in their education, and so it was a really good fit. The Tribal Weather and Climate Resources team are supporting peer-to-peer learning via weather condition webinars. They've hosted 5 to date, and they're looking forward to being able to meet in person to develop more climate resources specific to tribes. The Projections to People team are on a fact-finding mission to understand who uses drought products, and if they're not using them, then why not? We want to ensure that users find the information relevant and easy to interpret. The Eastern New Mexico team are all about responding to the current drought. They have hosted 3 webinars about drought response led by experienced farmers and ranchers in Eastern New Mexico and neighboring states. And the team working on drought response in Utah are holding a webinar on December 4th, which is intended to engage resource managers in reporting drought impacts to the Utah Drought Task Force, and then ultimately to the Drought Monitor to ensure that the conditions on the ground are represented in the Drought Monitor maps. And speaking of responding to drought, there is in the Southwest currently an exceptional and extreme drought. And so the group chose to come together to respond more rapidly and collectively to this drought. We're working with NIDIS to host short conditions, outlooks, and resources webinars, just 30 minutes each month. We are also developing a scripted 2-minute update that will be recorded by Climate Hub team. We're also working very deliberately to link this information both to the print media outlets, but also to radio programs and translating the information for tribes in the area as needed. And we're also sharing Seymour Drought, which is a National Drought Mitigation Center product that allows resource managers to report the drought conditions in their area. So we're hearing more directly from folks in the field. So as we were developing this new effort early this year, there were a few things that made it helpful, or that we found helpful in putting it together. The first was a white paper. So experts got together and developed a fairly short white paper on what the network is, the goals and the efforts of this. And so we've referred back to that white paper as we've progressed and the network has been expanding. We also conducted a resource manager survey early in 2020 to understand what resource managers needed and what information they might like, and to direct some of our efforts. We also collaborated with some people who are expert on networks, what makes a successful network, and we invited them to our first meeting to learn from people who understand how to develop something like this. We have a very collaborative ethic to the point where we weren't including any of our logos on any of our materials at the beginning. And so it's really open and collaborative, and people are always invited to contribute their ideas and build upon what they're already doing. We do use collaboration software, and that's been really helpful this first year. We're trying to leverage some existing systems, such as the CCAST case study system I mentioned earlier. We're also trying to capitalize on some existing strengths and things people are already doing, what's already on your work plan that you could bring to the learning network. We did establish some working groups around topics and issues right at the beginning with some leadership teams who were set to try to make these things happen within the first year. We also wanted to build in some flexibility to respond to emerging drought, and that seems to be working really well. Again, we have some shared ownership. So this is a very open learning network. Many people are involved. To date, over 36 organizations are participating. And then we have some consistent network champions, some people who consistently check in, make sure our meetings are happening and people are progressing forward. In summary, drought is an ever-present threat in the West. Multiple institutions and agencies from diverse sectors are working on drought prediction, monitoring, and response. However, aside from coordination with the Drought Monitor authors, there's historically been limited interaction and collaboration between agencies. To improve access to drought resources and to support all agencies working on drought, the founding members of the Drought Learning Network created this effort. The network now has more than 67 partners representing more than 34 institutions and agencies. In 2020, the network hosted at least 9 public webinars reaching more than 650 stakeholders and 3 quarterly team meetings. While we can count webinars and meetings and people attending, the more intangible outcome of the Drought Learning Network has been the sense of community that continues to grow amongst members who were maybe not so well connected before. Our next steps with the network are to continue to foster this collaborative ethic. There's no doubt that being connected and sharing the load of leadership has helped us as a diverse group to develop resources and share information that might otherwise have been silent. Our initial teams will continue to work on our initial topics, but we do anticipate more topics as our membership grows and additional needs are identified. So with that, thanks very much, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Good day. I'm Dennis Toddy, Director of the USDA Midwest Climate Hub, and with my co-author Doug Cluck, the NOAA Regional Climate Service Director in Kansas City. We're going to be talking a bit about the Central U.S. Climate Service's actions and lessons learned from the 2019 floods and wetness. An extreme event, since we're talking in the session about extreme events, on how climate services played into what was delivered during that time, some of the lessons learned, and how we've been able to do climate services in the Midwest region. Definition of what regional climate services are, a more formal definition. This has been used by my co-author Doug Cluck, and he's borrowed from other folks along the way as to what regional climate services are. But that top line is really what the guts of it are. Development and delivery of climate information services, time and spatial scales for decision makers. Basically a service that is using information, interpreting information, and giving it to decision makers to be able to use in an appropriate method. Not only to make decisions, but sometimes even to confirm decisions that are already made, that they made the best decision with the information available. All of these are things that we assess and try to look at when we're dealing with key pieces of information about climate services. There's all different pieces that are included: monitoring, data, prediction, outreach, education. Not everyone can do all these, or not all entities are capable of doing these or have these in their mission. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit, but these are all important and can all be done by different partners, and that's why it's important that we have partners. We'll talk more about that also as we go. What happened in 2019, even in 2018, 2019, extremely wet conditions all across the north central U.S. We're talking the northern plains into the upper Midwest, created a large number of issues from a flooding standpoint, from flooded fields, huge amount of damage that was done because of this, and it was well documented in a number of different cases. The ag side may be a little less documented because the impacts of the agriculture issues were a little lesser known. What we're showing you here is RMA crop indemnities, basically crop insurance indemnities paid out because of crop losses. The brown areas are over $10 million in that county. So you can see the worst areas most hit by some of the wetness, delayed planting, and yield. Pieces of the wetness in the 2018-2019. In the upper left-hand side is the 24-month accumulated precipitation from 1895 until the present. Seeing on the right-hand side how extreme that 2-year period was all across the north central U.S., well above previous records. So, here we're looking at over 75 inches average precipitation over that 2-year period. And this is over the whole north central U.S., a huge amount of water over that region. On the lower left-hand side, NOAA's billion-dollar disasters. Well known was the Missouri River flood and Nebraska flood in March. and Mississippi River flooding all along the way. But again, there are lots of ag issues related to this too. On the right-hand side, showing corn progress by the latter part of May. By this point, most corn and soybeans are planted and actually starting to emerge. These showing all states in the upper area where corn for grain is grown well behind their emergence at that time period because the wet conditions delayed planting, and then delayed after delayed planting, the emergence of crops, all being very. What services were provided? What did we do with some of our partners all across the region? The backbone of the services we provide are monthly climate webinars. These have been going on since about 2012. They're a monthly webinar presented by usually state climatologists or other climate service partners, where we talk about what's going on, what the outlooks say, lots of chance for Q&A with experts, highlight what's going on. So these are the backbone, have been going on all during this time. We continued those all through this as an information piece. And in 2019, because of the extremes, we added on special hydro sessions and special ag sessions where we talked about some of these more detailed issues related to the flooding and related to agriculture issues specific to those audience. NOAA contributed to the hydro side, the Climate Hub doing the ag side of some special single event when we're able to see large events somewhat ahead of time, or a potential for a large event. We create some summary information, usually slide sets, with NOAA and National Weather Service partners that we share with people ahead of time to give people advance notice of major issues. When you're talking about extremes, the potential for damage is enhanced because of those extreme events. And in this case, we had an extreme event, so we were trying to release information to give people awareness of these ahead of time so they could prepare, hopefully mitigate damage, and be aware of the situation. Outlook and some of the background data. USDA is a strong partner in this. From the ag side, being able to make use of that data and apply it more directly to agricultural issues, because sometimes the extreme may not be a climatological extreme, but because of something happening in the agricultural community, it may be an issue. So we try to put that context, and that's one of the important things that we'll talk about too, is that the understanding of context, the understanding of importance of information to a stakeholder group, and being things that we do in partnership with these, understanding when we can see a shorter term event nearer real time, trying to fit this in outside of when the 7-day National Weather Service, but in that time period where we can make use of some of these issues. To these, we do more on the NOAA side, regional quarterly briefs where we do summaries and do an outlook information every quarter. The High Plains or the Northern Plains, the Midwest, and Great Lakes do all of these. We do these quarterly. We also do them for La Nina and El Nino events to highlight what the potentials are for these situations. And then during drought periods, 2019 there was not as much drought, but in 2020 there was. So one of the other sides of the extremes, again working with another partner, NIDIS and the National Drought Mitigation Center, being able to develop information for specific information. On the, when we're talking about stakeholder groups and partnering, working with this, the Midwest Climate Hub, we have a team called MACT, the Midwest Ag Climate Team. Basically, it is a group working with extension individuals, with cooperative extension. For people not familiar with that, they work with the land-grant university in each state. And their job is to work as an intermediary, generally between the university and stakeholder groups at a more regional or county level. We intervene and work very closely with them to help deliver that information because they have a better capability of delivering information on a local level, and also to share what conditions are and the problems that are occurring in those areas. So we work with our NOAA partners and also extension to share So the idea we have here, again, is partnering. We have a large number of partners. We're talking here about NOAA partners, more NOAA connections, regional climate centers, hydrologic centers, National Weather Service offices, state climatologists, NIDIS again, and the National Weather Service, the NOAA Climate Services Directors regions, all have purposes for existing. You can see there's a number of those all across the upper Midwest that have purpose for being there. And that's why partnering is most important, to be able to take advantage of the expertise and usefulness across these various partners, and then to be able to deliver information down through them to various stakeholder groups, especially on the shorter term, getting through the National Weather Service offices. They are a well-recognized local entity where they can deliver information. State climatologists are, again, these are all critical partners in trying to gather, synthesize, and make use of information to deliver information in an ability for people. Expertise. And expertise, when we're talking about here, is expertise in understanding weather and climate and what's going on and being able to explain what's going on, but then also expertise of different stakeholder groups to understand the impact of weather and climate for that group, to be able to make use of information, take an outlook and say, well, okay, this may not look like a big issue, but because of something going on in this area, you know, like an example of a climate prediction center outlook that has equal chances for precipitation. Well, if you have soils that are dry already and you have equal chances for precipitation going into a high water use time of year, that's a problem. It may not say you're getting drier, but understanding the situation, you can make interpretation of that information. And also expertise sometime of understanding larger situations. You know, this kind of looks like this sort of a situation, and this could be a problem or something to be aware of to be able to help deliver. Some other guidelines, again, from my co-author, you know, you have to be iterative and consistent. Especially, you know, we started doing the monthly webinars after the 2011 flood. We made the decision right after that we needed to keep doing this, that we can't just come in during an extreme and do something and then disappear. You have to be consistent and be there on a regular basis so that people know and recognize that, and you have the relationships built and that information delivery built to be able to continue to do that so that they know you're there. If you disappear until big events come around, then you have to reestablish relationships, and opportunities may be lost in this time period. So, and extremes, again, are just that. They are opportunities. They are opportunities to take advantage of. They are opportunities to prove value. And while they have a higher risk, they also have a higher reward if you're able to mitigate some risk or to be able to provide afterwards. As there are obviously plenty of challenges related to this. You know, many climate services don't fit into the specific purview. That's why the partnerships, again, are important, because you're able to take advantage of responsibilities in different scales, different expertise, to be able to try to do that. Otherwise, it doesn't fit into a time scale, or it doesn't fit into a certain mold that is a responsibility of one entity. That's why you have to work with a lot of entities. There is a huge amount of coordination that has to occur, and has to occur across all levels of government, federal to state, tribal, sector. You have to be able to include these and be able to do this and make this work. Extreme events take time. They take more time, and sometimes it's a value to be able to be aware that an extreme event may be coming, because you can prepare and be ready to deal with that. The other challenges that we have are, like many things, the resources. Resource people. Not a lot of people are committed specifically to doing this. We often use parts of people's time from doing other things, but they're willing to cooperate with us. So not only people, time, there's a time limitation and a fund limitation. We may want to create something, or this entity would be really good to have, but sometimes funds are not available to try to do that. So fortunately, unfortunately, sometimes we do a lot of work in kind, sharing information in kind. The ability to predict sometimes is still not as good as we are. And the other part is, how do we know how well we've done? That's an important piece, is how do we know what has happened? How are people making decisions? We've had a couple efforts at this along the way and have been able to assess some of the impact, but we still need more to be done in that area. So if you have more questions, and we'll have more conversations as we go along here, you can contact myself or Doug Cluck. You can see our emails there. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you very much for letting me wind up this important session on the progress on climate services in the context of extremes before, during, and after. As we begin to think through these questions, it's important that we try to grasp what is also being learned internationally, so we can feed that information back into what we're doing within the US and with our communities as well. This talk is on the international progress on climate information services, on climate services. My name is Roger Polwarty. I'm the senior scientist in the physical sciences lab at NOAA. A lot of folks play a role in all of the information that you're going to see here, a lot from the World Meteorological Organization, from the IRI and elsewhere. But most critically, many of the people you've seen earlier in this session, Doug Cluck, Mark Swoboda, Dennis Toddy, Robin Webb, and others. So as we begin to think through this, the major effort that has been put into climate services globally comes from the World Meteorological Organization Global Framework for Climate Services. It was established in 2009, and the World Climate Conference, where this was established, is taken pretty seriously. This was the third one, and the first two are things that launched the ozone protocol, science behind the ozone protocol, the IPCC, the Global Climate Observing System, the World Climate Research Program. So a lot of weather, water, and climate institutions, programs, and capabilities have been launched through the World Climate Conference, and the last one launched the Global Framework on Climate Services. As we keep an eye on what the Global Framework does, we also know that since this has been established more than 10 years ago, there is growing demand for information and services. There are changing environments and increasing risks, rapidly changing technologies, progress in science itself, and pressures on public budgets as well. So I'll come back to how that matters to how we deliver services and how all of these things influence the global framework. As we think through climate services, we know that services are supposed to provide climate information to help individuals and organizations make climate smart decisions. Some of the questions being asked: should I plan a meningitis vaccination drive in my region? Do I need to plant drought-resistant seeds in the next season? Will we be starting to restrict the use of water in the near term? How much solar energy can I rely on over time to develop renewable energy capabilities? What the global framework does is, in getting at these questions, it asks, how do we align the national and international databases, which is being done? What socioeconomic variables are we aiming towards? And how do we create the partnerships and customized products for different user communities? The priority areas of the global framework are water, disaster risk reduction, health, agriculture and food security, and energy. And in this context and in this panel, we're mainly dealing with the issue of disaster risk management and reduction, a priori, the role of using better and improved climate information in the context of reducing and managing disaster risk. So that's the focus in the context of extremes. It is supported by the Climate Information Services Information System. I co-chair part of that with others. The research of the World Climate Research Program and the partners around the globe, such as NOAA, ECMWF and others, a user interface platform, and capacity development, leveraging the capabilities from development agencies and lending institutions such as the World Bank. So what is a climate information system? A climate information system coherently organizes different types of information, and by climate information, we mean temperature, precip, extremes, issues concerning cumulative degree days, trends in the nature of drought risk, trends in the nature of flood risk across the board. There's a set of variables and activities, essential climate variables that we deal with when we're talking about climate information. And most critically, an information system facilitates the technical assistance to help decision makers understand how to integrate that information into their planning processes. So the value chain view of climate services at the country level, as I just mentioned, involves data from observations, from forecasting, the service delivery components, the links to decisions and outcomes, which are embedded in the gray area of climate information services. And the Climate Services Information System of the Global Framework is the principal mechanism through which climate information, past, present, and future, will be routinely archived, modeled, analyzed, processed, and exchanged. The mechanisms by which links to nations, regions, and communities around the globe are being met is actually key. How do we leverage the capabilities at the regional level that strengthens the national frameworks for climate services? In the redefinition of the Climate Outlook Fora, which have now been around since the 97-98 El Nino event, the stronger view towards climate across timescales, not just seasonal, but including seasonal, and engagement of all of the public, private, academic, and community-based stakeholders in the region are now being coordinated through the Climate Outlook Forum. They are the operational and institutional mechanisms to collate, process, exchange, and disseminate information about past, present, and future climate nationally, regionally, and globally. One example in which this is being done is in the Caribbean Global Framework for Climate Services, or the Caribbean Regional Framework for Climate Services, working closely with island countries in the region. It was established in 2010 in partnerships throughout the region with NOAA, with WMO, and others. The central institution being the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. And through a series of workshops, consultations, and other activities, the CIMH was designated as an official regional climate center of the WMO within the Global Framework on Climate Services, the hub around which all of those activities take place. Most critically, this approach was endorsed at the special meeting of the Caribbean Council for Trade and Economic Development. So the authoritative underwriting of this process exists. So it's not simply that, hey, we have a study and it says this information is credible or this information is relevant. More importantly, there's an authoritative base that is provided behind the knowledge and information being developed with and delivered to communities in the region. So it has a credible, authoritative, and legitimate base behind it. One example that is being done through the CIMH is the Caribbean Early Warning Information Systems across climate timescales. This is a regional consortium of several partners, from emergency management to the Red Cross and others throughout the region. It's a key mechanism that champions the design, development, and delivery of tailored climate products. It has sector-specific climate indices, working with others on how to facilitate and identify the needs for different georeference data sets, but most importantly, it also helps foster the research that examines the associations between climate and impacts and puts this knowledge together with the other meteorological and hydrological services into the public. We can show very directly where this process through the CIMH helped reduce disaster risk from the 2013-2016 drought in the Caribbean, the worst drought in 50 years, and during the 2017 devastating hurricane season. We could show very clearly where lives were saved and actions were put into place to help protect properties. Things could have been worse were it not for this process. Along with that information system is the user information platform that creates a space to advance services. And in that, they promote effective decision-making and awareness of the uncertainties and the value of climate services. Users can make their voices heard, and the stakeholder meetings, now the Climate Outlook Fora, bring meteorologists, climatologists, other practitioners, and the community, not just the user in the sense of who uses a piece of information for planting or reservoir management, but the people around them who also fund those activities. This is the UIP, or the User Information Platform, interface platform, that goes along with the Climate Service Information Development that allows for deeper engagement into the region. At the same time, there are many hybrids of public and private efforts being conducted, such as the Copernicus system, and Copernicus is a key partner in the Global Framework on Climate Services, there's a partner advisory group that Copernicus co-chairs to help develop and implement public-private partnerships under the global framework. So what is the status after all of these activities? A lot is being done in governance and basic systems, in the user interface, in capacity development, in the provision and application of services, and monitoring and evaluation. The climate service capacities are being assessed on an ongoing basis. And as I mentioned, while a lot has been done, the benefits have been shown economically, socially, and environmentally to greatly outweigh the cost. And yet the capacity to deliver and access these services is uneven and inadequate. And that is where strengthening the climate service information system comes in. Why do we need to do this? We need to equip our communities with information, products, services, and tools that allow them to become more resilient. Communities across the countries are becoming more vulnerable to severe events. And as Kathy Sullivan used to like to say, science needs to be at the table. How do we move, not simply bouncing back to a place of risk, but bouncing forward in the context of not just single events, multiple events, combined or compounding events such as hotter droughts, but complex and cascading risk. Drought followed by floods, droughts and floods, creating technological risks such as releases from toxic reservoirs that we saw during Hurricane Harvey in Houston. The side effects and cascading risks that happen, impacts of droughts around the globe that affect food securities and food security in particular locations. So how can we bounce forward? So beyond usefulness of information or even usability of information, we need to be focused on better decisions. That's the outcome we're after. And usefulness and usability by themselves doesn't get us there. In a changing environment, we address the scientific challenges of compound and cascading risks, as I mentioned, but critical to that is to sustain local observations. There's no substitute for local observations. Development of forecasts of opportunities. The skill naturally higher for some places at some times. Do different combinations of variables give us a better forecast for specific events? How can we learn better from past single events? And you've heard some of that today. And how might skill change with base state changes? Most critically, impacts-based forecasting, assessment, and scenario development must approach the model output very critically in the context of local observations, forecasts of opportunity, and the potential for surprises. The second thing is to take the knowledge governance seriously, not just the provision and delivery of information and services. The architecture of participation and the alignment that allows us to bring in the public and private sector, academia, NGOs, and other communities to articulate the benefits of actions and the cost of inaction. And this may not be as quantitative as we'd like to be, so storyline approaches are critical. It's important in that process to recognize while co-production is important for single users, it can also be an incentive to create power asymmetries with those who are left out of that decision-making. So we have to be very vigilant in that process. The other aspect is to adopt a culture or partnership of risk management, right? Public administration supportive of adaptive management, i.e. learning about complex risks. Most critical are the capabilities to inform that management through changing conditions and transitions. And then to finance that innovation, not just the products, but the processes that allow us to engage as events unfold. So what does governance of this risk to resilience continuum mean? And this question is becoming a bigger issue throughout the Sendai disaster risk reduction process, throughout the Sustainable Development Goals, and definitely through the UNFCCC adaptation process. We need to ensure political authority and policy coherence, develop a culture of partnerships, decentralize step by step, and most importantly, be in the region. Partners do not just share data, they also share risks and responsibilities. And you've heard examples of how some of this is working, but we are not yet at scale that makes us a society that navigates the risk to resilience continuum. So most critically in that context is accountability and efficiency. Efficiency being the locally implemented, and accountability being the standards of practice, prototypes for learning, and examples of good practice. Who does this? The knowledge and skills for navigating through the conditions. More than translators of information are needed, but what we call policy entrepreneurs or norm entrepreneurs, the people who keep the principles of effective climate services in view while operating, that makes institutions work and live up to their goals. The integrators, seekers, champions, and catalysts of innovation. And you've heard several of them on this panel. All of these ideas, the examples and cases are in WMO reports, State of Climate Services, Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, where we had a paper earlier this year, Future of Climate Services, technical reference document on the Climate Service Information System, and in a paper that we just submitted called Climate Services from Risk to Resilience, with several people on this panel. The ongoing goal is to sustain collaborative networks across research, observations, services, and decision-making. In this case, I picked on, because Mark Swoboda was with us, the issue of drought. Drought is driven internationally by impacts in different parts of the world, the food baskets of the world. There are different levels of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And locally, the conditions of soil moisture, vegetation, environmental degradation begin to matter. So what do we mean as we move through the cycle from disaster management to living and thriving with uncertainty is to put all of these pieces together, i.e. to create effective, sustained, and supported climate services. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mark Swoboda, and I'm the director of the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Thanks for listening in today. I'd like to take you on a little walkthrough of our activities as we celebrate our 25th year of existence. The center was founded in 1995, and we'll give a high altitude overview of some of the services and work we've been doing around the world. The National Drought Mitigation Center is based on 3 primary focus areas: monitoring and early warning, policy and planning, and vulnerability and risk assessment. Through a variety of tools and vehicles, our goal as a boundary organization is to translate science to the public, to the media, and to policymakers. We do this by engaging with them directly and use a variety of techniques using education, outreach, and engagement methods, working with extension and working directly with practitioners and policy and decision makers on the ground. The goal is to make our information usable. That at the end of the day, we want to provide and package information in a way that folks can take and use for their own purposes and applications. And you can see here in the green bubbles, we have a variety of audiences that we tailor to, and not just one, in order to make that information actionable. Our work is scattered across the world. You can see here the countries in light blue we've worked with over the last 3 to 5 years, and the countries in dark blue, and I would include Canada and Mexico in that with the North American Drought Monitor work, are countries we've worked with in just the past year. This is done with a variety of partners and collaborators around the world, including a lot of groups within the United Nations, Food and Agriculture Organization, Developmental Program, and Convention to Combat Desertification, just to name a few. And more recently, over the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of work being done through the Integrated Drought Management Program, which is co-led by the World Meteorological Organization and the Global Water Partnership, IDMP for short. In addition, developmental banks such as the World Bank and working with USAID and others in developing countries to bring and transfer this technology freely to these countries. Here's just an example of a few of these activities that we're currently underway with that are trying to work with them to develop drought early warning systems, but also work on all 3 pillars that I mentioned earlier. How do they take this information and trigger action and policy through mitigation or plans? How do they conduct user vulnerability and risk assessments, for example? These are just some of the products that come out of those efforts in various areas, including South America and Brazil and Africa, both in the Greater Horn, North Africa, and in Southern Africa, as you can see here, and in the Middle East, North Africa region, specifically with our work with USAID. So, as I've mentioned already several times, this is not done in a vacuum just by ourselves. We really do reach out and rely on working with the folks on the ground in those respective countries and entities, and with our federal and national and international partners at all scales. This is just a smattering. I don't have time to go into detail on all of these resource guides, but that information is all freely available on our website. You can find us at drought.unl.edu. Examples include working with FEMA on a threat hazards, bringing drought into that risk assessment conversation in that application toolkit, working with the private sector in the top center, planning and drought with the American APA's American Planning Association, and working on a document that went out and took the pulse of their practitioners. What information do they need, and how do they need it packaged to integrate drought into their planning in a variety of ways? And then also working with individuals, including drought risk on the ranch in the middle there, working with Extension in several states in the United States, over 1,000 participants of ranchers and other users from southern Canada all the way down to the U.S.-Mexico border. So this planning has really evolved over the last 30, 40 years, and more recently, it's really focused on individual and community level planning in a variety of ways. I mentioned managing drought risk on the ranch. This is individual producers, ranchers, working to put down best practices and decision calendars into usable information for others to learn from. Communities, obviously, and I would include utilities in that, as well as working with tribes and states, which we have since we began back in the 90s. And then, of course, on up to basin and national level planning activities as well, not just here in the United States, but globally. At the end of the day, though, all planning starts local. Lessons we've learned along the way there is initially a lot of drought plans were standalone with competing resources and people's time and having to wear many hats. It makes sense that it's better to have some drought in there integrated into a variety of planning efforts. I've listed some of these at the bottom of the slide, whether it's a multi-hazard plan that FEMA requires of all states. Can we get drought in there as an addendum? We're seeing a move towards that, as well as in climate change adaptation plans and comprehensive or water plans as well. At the end of the day, though, context matters, and it's never a prescriptive process. So it's going to be tailored to what they need in each and every example. Education is another big part of what we do, not just K through 12, as you can see here in the top right on Drought for Kids in our education tab on our website, but aimed at adult education, working with Extension. What are the basics of drought? What sort of activities? Notice the drought game on the bottom right. All this stuff is there for people to take and modify to their context, and we encourage that and more than happy to work with folks in doing that. Another area that's really blossomed over the last 5+ years now is the idea of conducting drought management exercises or simulations or games or scenarios. You can see now we're starting to see more guidance in this area. We've developed a guide with our partners at NIDIS and others to sort of lay out the variety of these exercises, because they do vary depending on if you have a lot of resources and get very complex with modeling, or is it a very simple, low resource scenario based exercise. Each of those methods can be very effective, and I would encourage you to check this out and contact us if you would like more information in the future. Decision support is big too. Tools, development of databases, user interfaces to make it as easy as we can. It's obviously a complex subject, but we're trying to accommodate, again, all those partners and users I've mentioned earlier in the talk, ranging from U.S. ag and drought, which is going to be focused on commodities. On the bottom right, we're trying to integrate more ways of capturing and including social media. In this case, either Twitter, looking at tweets for drought in the context of how drought affects people, or can we get them to do sort of an easier way to find ways for them to contribute condition monitoring or drought impacts into a national repository that we can then combine using machine learning with physical drought indicators like some of the others on this page. GRACE from NASA, QuickDry, which is a flash drought indicator, and look into historical indices and impacts through tools like our Drought Impact Reporter and the Drought Risk Atlas, which is in the top right. The U.S. Drought Monitor has been around since 1999 and is a three-way partnership with the Drought Center, USDA, and NOAA. It's a composite indicator, but the point I want to emphasize on this map is the built-in ground truth or sanity check of the 450 plus experts on the ground in each of the states. And I'll show you a slide of that demographic and distribution next. This has a lot of policy implications as a trigger. The biggest one probably being the Farm Bill and Livestock Forage and Conservation Reserve Program. It's become the state of the science drought indicator for the U.S. and has been modeled by many around the world, including becoming the USDA Secretary of Agriculture's fast track designation tool. Recently, in the last year or so, give or take, we have now expanded the Drought Monitor operationally into the U.S. Virgin Islands on the bottom left, and on the top left into the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands. So a little different there, not the same amount of indicators, smaller amount of area, so you don't have all the same tools at your disposal, but we still have that great network on the ground that meets every week and provides guidance and provides ground truthing to the products we do have in order to make that map operationally happen every week. And to the tune now that we're producing nearly 30,000 new maps at a variety of scales, tribes, basins, counties, etc., every week. This is a recent picture of the Drought Monitor here come mid-November. You can see a pretty significant drought is entrenched over most of the western half of the United States. So with La Nina on the horizon, we anticipate a lot of potential impacts coming up as we head into 2021, and already a lot of impacts on the ground and implications for drought now. So this bears watching going forward. This is the demographic I spoke of earlier, the distribution of the 450 plus participants of what we call our expert user group, located in the states to provide ground truth, local level data, and ground truth, and look at the federal, national scale data to make sure we're not missing something. It's a very iterative process. They have some ownership in that process by keeping us on our toes and working with them to get the picture right on the ground and on the map. I'd like to take the last few minutes just to focus on a new topic that's emerged and what tools are out there to help us tackle it, and that's flash drought, what we commonly see referred to as rapid onset droughts. The two most iconic flash drought examples are, of course, the 2012 case in the central U.S. and in 2017 in sort of the central high plains region of the United States. Notice the two bottom maps on the left and right. These are change maps showing the degree of getting better or worse in the Drought Monitor. On the bottom left, this was the difference between May 8th and the end of July. So basically over a 3-month period, 3, 4, or 5 class degradation over a huge area right in our grain belt and livestock areas as well for forage. And on the bottom right, high plains, you can see here the implications for ranchers and other commodities in that region where we saw 3 to 5 class degradation in a matter of 6 weeks. So very rapid onset droughts causing lots of impacts. We need new tools to monitor that. So a lot have come online, spurred initially by that 2012 drought through research and development. We've seen ways to better capture various parameters within the hydrologic cycle on the soil moisture side, on the evapotranspiration side, and vegetation stress side. And all of these do help us tackle emerging issues like flash drought. I just show us an example of a few here, but certainly not an exhaustive list of the new tools at our disposal. So we have many challenges in going forward with this issue of flash drought. First off, the need for more accurate seasonal to subseasonal to seasonal forecasting. Drought covers days to decades, and so that in and of itself is a very inherent issue that we have to try and overcome. and better diligent monitoring and forecasting will have to happen, because drought early warning is both monitoring and forecasting. The transition from these tools from the research environment to operational is also very important, and often the funds aren't there to do that and stand it up and keep it up. And perhaps flash drought can be the torchbearer to change our mindset of that droughts are always slow onset, and by doing so we can change the mindset to be more proactive in how we react to drought, but also how we plan and mitigate drought on a much more timely matter. Lessons learned: a cycle we've seen is formed where, as monitoring and early warning systems improve, the need for better strategies and services increases. And then as those mitigation strategies and services are implemented, the need for improved drought monitoring and early warning increases. So it is a cycle that feeds on itself. And the need for value-added information is really what drives this process. And finally, the NDMC is dedicated to developing usable tools and information and services. We really rely on those strong partners on the ground with us to make that happen. And at the end of the day, our common goal is to link this scientific knowledge with the actions needed to reduce future impacts of drought. Thank you very much. Please feel free to contact me, and you can see my information here on the screen.